Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode UFO Displays, 7 Strange Sightings. As a general rule, UFOs are evasive. Those sightings are usually brief, often quite distant, and off they go on their way. You can't just go outside at any given time and see a UFO. However, on other occasions, this type of behavior makes a 180-degree turnaround, and UFOs behave in a way that can only be called a display, where they brazenly show themselves as if wanting to be seen. And in fact, I think that's exactly what they are doing. They want us to know about them. There are a lot of cases like this. I want to present 7 cases in this episode that I've personally investigated where UFOs show this type of brazen showing off behavior, putting on a display. I think these cases are not only interesting in that regard, but also have some other interesting elements that provide information about the nature of the UFO phenomenon. So that's why I wanted to do this episode for you today. These cases stretch back decades all the way up to current times, and I think you'll find them quite interesting. I certainly hope so. At any rate, let's just get started. And the first case I want to talk about, I call a Boy Scout UFO encounter. This case is really interesting because it occurred in 1945. This is before Roswell, before the modern age of UFOs, and it occurred to a group of Boy Scouts who were camping out in California at Mount Baden-Powell. This is a national forest area, and the main witness is a gentleman I used to work with by the name of Joe Stein. As a little boy, he was out with a group of about 20 other young Boy Scouts when everyone woke up to view a dramatic UFO display. And I'll just let Joe describe their sighting in his own words. As he says, "I remember waking up and looking out, and on the horizon I saw these 3 lights. I think they were somewhat stationary. I don't remember them moving from one area to another. The first thing I thought was, what are those lights doing there? If I remember correctly, they weren't that far. But the thing that bothered me more than anything was the distance between the lights. In other words, it was a large something. Whatever it was not small. They were bright enough that I knew there were 3 different colors. I remember there was a variety of colors." So Joe estimates that this object was about a half-mile away. He and his fellow Boy Scouts watched it for about 20 minutes, and they never saw it move. There was no sound, and at some point they went to bed. Of course, they investigated to see if there was any structures in the area, which there was not. This was a wilderness area, and none of them were able to figure out what this thing was. At that time, there wasn't much talk of UFOs really at all. So they didn't have any theories until later when the subject of UFOs became more popular. It's a very interesting sighting, not only because it's a multi-witness sighting, but it involves a very large, apparently structured object, and it's a very long sighting, and typical of these sort of cases in which UFOs appear to want to be seen. So that's the first case I'd like to present, but there are others. Here's another case which I call the Blue Ridge Parkway sighting. This occurred in 1954, and the main witness I call Bob. That is his real name, but he did not want his last name used. He's currently a musician and a magazine article writer. And as a young kid, around age 8, he had an incredible sighting while driving with his parents along the Blue Ridge Parkway in central Virginia. It was daytime. They're cruising along the highway. His parents are deeply involved in a discussion, and Bob is sitting in the back seat. And looking outside his window, he sees an enormous, bright silver, disc-shaped craft pacing his car high up in the sky, moving in and out of the clouds. And again, I'll just let Bob describe in his own words what he saw. As he says, I was riding in the back seat of the car. I was with my parents, and I looked up, and I saw a large disk going through the clouds. It was just scattered clouds, but it was going in and out of the clouds. It would come out, you'd see a large disk, and it would enter into a cloud. It wasn't above or below it, it would go through it. And it was easily the size of our 747s. It was fast, roughly the same speed as a jet fighter. A silver-colored, aluminum-colored disk. It was way up there. I tried to get them to see it. I pointed, and I got in a lot of trouble for interrupting their conversation, and they yelled at me for that. About 15 minutes later, when they got through talking, they turned around and said, "Okay, now what was it you had to say that was so important?" Of course, it was gone by then, and even at age 8, I knew better than to say it was a flying saucer, because then I'd really get in trouble. But it was there. I really saw it. I can't say what I saw. It was a disk. It was a very large disk. It was not my imagination. So this is another very interesting daylight sighting. He saw it for a good minute or two, and it was very large, very obvious. It was not a plane or helicopter. He's quite sure about that. And it made him a lifelong believer in UFOs. And this is a good lesson for parents out there. When a child or anyone really says that they are seeing something, take the time to look, and you could have an experience that you will not soon forget. And now we move on to another case, and I call this one 2 UFO displays for ARNI WHYLER. This case is very interesting. It involves a gentleman who works for NBC as an adult, and he has had 4 major sightings. I'm just going to present 2 here today, 2 which involve this really unusual display type of behavior. One occurred when he was just a little boy. He was 8 years old, and he lived in an apartment building in Cleveland, Ohio, that overlooked Lake Erie. And one evening, he asked his parents if he could camp out on the balcony of their apartment, and they agreed. And he went out there in his sleeping bag and his flashlight, and it wasn't long after darkness had fallen that Arnie witnessed a dramatic UFO display. It started with an unusually bright star-like object, and when he saw that it was unusual, he kept his eye on it, and he was glad he did, because it started to do things no star can do. As Arnie says, and I quote, "There was a star that got a little bit bright and a little bit brighter. And of course I kept watching it because it kept getting brighter and brighter, and it seemed like it was growing. And then it started moving in a clockwise circle, very small, kind of like vibrating a little bit. And it moved in a wider and wider circle, a huge circle. And when it hit the bottom of this circle, it stopped. It just stopped dead. Of course, I kept watching it because I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then it went off to the west. It just shot right off. After this thing darted away, Arnie ran inside and told his parents, and they did not believe him. He was quite disappointed at that. And that would not be his only sighting. It certainly did convince him that UFOs were real. And he would later have more sightings. And the second one I'd like to talk about was a very strange sighting involving high strangeness on multiple levels. And this one occurred on October 14, 1990. At the time, he was living in a home in Pasadena in Southern California. And it started when he had a very sudden and very strong impulse to look outside. As Arnie says, "I got this funny feeling I should look out the window. I don't know why I got the funny feeling I should look out the window, but I got up and I went over to the fireplace and I looked out the window and a spot of light appeared over the house. It went off from east to west, off to the horizon line. Then it shrank from the size of a quarter to a pinpoint of light. It also changed in color from a warm white to a very, very bright, intense blue-white light. At this point, judging by its appearance and movement, ARNI realized he was seeing an actual UFO. He quickly ran back to the living room and woke up his brother, who was sleeping on the couch, and told him that he had just seen a UFO. But the experience was not over yet. At this point, something very strange happened. This weird wave of light swept over ARNI's house. As he says, it was as though you took a giant donut of light and ran it across the house so that it glowed only around the house, not down by the street. It was easily visible, and it illuminated all of the foliage around the house, but nowhere else. I just got the funny feeling something was up close. What's really interesting is when this wave of light swept over the house, ARNI noticed two things. His ears popped, as if he had gone up in elevation, and not only that, there was this eerie silence that settled over the entire area. UFO researchers are quite familiar with this effect, and it's called the Oz effect. And this can sometimes turn up in close encounters. And it certainly turned up in ARNI's case. It was very apparent to him. As he says, I went outside and there was absolutely no sound. The crickets had stopped making noise. It was absolutely silent. My ears felt like they were going up another level in height. It was as though I had gone up to about 5,000 feet. But it didn't hurt. It had that sort of silent feeling. It was absolutely silent until I got to the street. And then the normal noises appeared. ARNI went back inside, and his brother was still in there trying to wake up. And he did see the light sweep over the house, but nothing else. At this point, the sounds returned to normal, and the sighting appeared to be over. But ARNI did notice one other important and I think significant detail. As he says, on my retina, the blue light, when it got to a fine pinpoint towards the horizon, it burned the color into my retina. So every time I closed my eyes, I could clearly see the image of what I saw in the sky. It was a perfectly round disc, a little oval, and I saw it on my retina for at least 2 or 3 hours afterwards. So this was clearly some kind of display, and it's got several strange elements. I think the most interesting is that ARNI had a very strong flash of precognition or a weird impulse to look outside. And as soon as he did, this is when this UFO appeared. The other interesting details are, of course, this weird Oz effect and also the physiological effect of this after image on his retina, which lasted for 2 or 3 hours. So this goes to prove that there was something actually there. Eye irritation, light sensitivity is one of the most common physiological effects as a result of a UFO encounter. So it was a very interesting sighting, and it appears that these UFO occupants wanted ARNI to see them and made it sure that he looked outside before they appeared. And now I'd like to move to another case, which shows a very interesting aspect of UFO behavior. And I call this next case the repeater problem. A UFO sighting is often a once-in-a-lifetime event. However, for some people, it's not. It's something they experience over and over again throughout their lives. And that's certainly what happened with Ronnie Barron. He's had well over a dozen sightings. He doesn't believe he's a contactee. He has just seen UFOs on many, many occasions. He had a very interesting sighting as a little boy in Biloxi, Mississippi, when he saw a powder blue disc, an orb rather, shooting across the sky. And he's had a lot of sightings. I just want to talk about 3 of the major ones, each of which was clearly a display. At some point, Ronnie Barron moved to ENCINO here in Southern California and started seeing UFOs again. And this often happened when he would step outside at night to look at the stars, and these objects would appear, start darting around, and move off. And he told his teenage son about these sightings, but his teenage son did not believe him until one time they both together had a dramatic UFO display appear overhead. This occurred in the early 1970s, again in ENCINO, California. Ronnie and his son stepped outside, and 5 orb-like objects started darting around in really amazing maneuvers and patterns. As Ronnie says, I saw 5 one night in a cluster, and they were close. I was outside with my son. It blew him away. He wanted to deny it. He didn't want to believe it. Like, no, this can't be. He was just totally blown away by it because this cluster was up close. They stayed kind of still in one spot, and they came together, and then they'd split really fast. They'd separate and go higher. It was kind of cool. Whatever these things are, they're in touch with each other, and they're doing things together. They obviously have some kind of heavy communication because they were doing all these strategic things together. They knew how to split. They knew how to take off in an instant. Like somebody said, ready, go, shoo! And in a few seconds, one shot straight up in the air, and they were out of sight. They were not visible anymore. They somehow separated. So this is a very interesting sighting because it shows that these objects are essentially showing off, dancing around each other in the sky in ways that our own aircraft can't do. I think this shows how technologically advanced they are. There was no sound associated with this. This was clearly not helicopters, planes, or shooting stars, or fireworks, or balloons, or anything like that. And it absolutely convinced Ronnie's son that UFOs were real. Of course, Ronnie himself was already convinced. And I think in this case, they were probably showing off to Ronnie's son so that he could become knowledgeable about the fact that these things are real and that we are not alone in this universe. I think that is the reason behind these UFO displays, the agenda. And I'd like to move to another case involving Ronnie Barron. And this occurred again in Encino, California, when Ronnie was attending a party at one of his friend's house. This was in the afternoon. It was a clear sky. There were about 20 people at the party, and Ronnie was the first to notice 4 or 5 objects up in the sky. And they were orb-like objects, bright white, and darting around in these very strange patterns that were really obvious to everyone that this could not be anything normal. As Ronnie says, they looked white, and they were flying in sharp triangles. I pointed them out. A lot of people were looking at them. We were all watching them go back and forth in these triangle motions, really fast, just turning on a dime, flying in one direction, and all of a sudden heading back in the opposite direction and going up to interlock these 2 lines. It would fly on a point and then make a square in the back of a triangle. They were moving in a little mile-wide area. So everyone just stared up at these things in awe, and this display went on for the entire length of the party, 3 or 4 hours, until people actually got bored looking at them and left. This is a clear example of a UFO display. What are they doing up there? Why are they darting around at right angles directly above a group of people? It seems pretty obvious that they want to be seen. And now I want to move to the last case involving Ronnie Barron. He's had other sightings before and since, but this one is a really dramatic sighting which had a very interesting element to it that you do not often see. Ronnie was driving with 3 of his friends through the Central Valley in Fresno, California, along the Interstate 5 freeway. And this was daytime, and as they were driving, Ronnie was in the passenger seat, his friend was driving, and the two other people were in the back sleeping. Suddenly, both Ronnie and his friend saw these two enormous white globes of light drop down out of the sky and head towards them directly over the freeway. It was very obvious, very brazen, and it was so big that both Ronnie and his friend thought that perhaps a 747 was coming in for a crash landing. Although they couldn't see any structure, there was just these two enormously bright white globes of light, like landing lights they thought at first. But as it got closer, it was clear to them that this was not a plane or anything conventional. And again, I will just let Ronnie describe in his own words what they saw. As he says, "It looked like lights coming down over the road, coming right at us. I looked at the driver of the car, and he looked at me. He didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. We saw these two things up there, and nobody said anything. And all of a sudden, these lights came straight at us and disappeared into the ground on the side of the car in an instant. They vanished right down into the ground. No smoke, no sound, and it happened so quickly. I looked at the guy driving, and he looked at me. We were both very puzzled. No noise, nothing. Just total silence. It disappeared into the ground. No explanation. Nothing you could say about that. It was like there was a tunnel or something waiting for it to come and land there. There's a lot of power operating those things somehow, but no sound at all, with all that force of power happening. It's kind of funny, unearthly, you know what I mean? Still, nobody said anything about it. It was mind-blowing. There was no explanation for it. It scared me because it reaffirmed that there's some kind of life and intelligence happening up there. To actually see it up close like that, you know that we're not here by ourselves. So Ronnie would later have more sightings. He believed UFO sightings are far more common than most people realize, and I agree, because most people do not report their sightings. Certainly Ronnie did not. None of the people in this episode did. So the vast majority of sightings go unreported. And this appears to be another example where this object was showing itself off on purpose to make another person a believer in UFOs. And what's most interesting to me about this case is that this object disappeared into the ground, as Ronnie says, as if a tunnel opened up. This is something I've heard before. I do know of other cases. These objects do have the ability to not only fly in the sky or in the water, but into the ground. They apparently have some force field around them that they can render solid objects permeable or are able to slide through water or trees or land as if it's not an obstacle at all. And this is another good example not only of a UFO display, but how truly advanced these craft, these beings are. It's a very interesting case. And moving along, I've got another really remarkable sighting. I call this next case Cavorting Stars over Palm Springs. The main witness in this case is another person I worked with for some time by the name of Chris Schwindler. And she had a very interesting sighting with her brother and friend while camping out in Palm Springs in 1978. They were actually out there on the desert, lying in their sleeping bags, when they were treated to a really remarkable and obvious UFO display. And again, I will let Chris describe in her own words what they saw. As she says, "We were laying around and looking up at the sky, and we saw these 3 different colored lights. And they circled around each other and went down and pulled apart and went down and pulled apart. And it lasted probably a couple of minutes, and then they went away. They were little, but they looked like stars. They were red, yellow, and green. They were lights. They looked like the size of stars from where we were. I don't know how high, but they were up there though. So Chris does not know what they saw. The only explanation she can think of is UFOs. They were silent, and they were not helicopters or planes or meteors or satellites or balloons or anything that she could figure out. Ball lightning, fireworks, no. And what's really interesting about this case is that these objects were 3 different colors. That keeps turning up in these UFO displays. It's as if these UFOs are putting on their lights with different colors, sort of to show off, show their presence. And the way they're darting around in these dancing, playful maneuvers is, I think, another indication that they are showing off. So although this was a brief sighting, it definitely made believers out of all 3 of these witnesses. And again, I think that is really the main agenda behind these types of UFO displays. The ETs want us to know about them, and they continue to pick groups of people, individually, small groups, and sometimes large, and show themselves off to various people. And the next case I want to talk about is one of the most dramatic UFO displays I've ever investigated, because this one was witnessed by a very large group of people. And I call this one, Thousands of People Saw It. This occurred around 1972 over the coastal Southern California cities of Costa Mesa, Laguna Beach, and the surrounding areas. The main witness in this case I call Walter. He does not want his name used. He's a former military officer, quite familiar with aircraft, and he had a very interesting sighting while in Laguna Beach. And as he says, this huge cloud-like lenticular-shaped object, cloud, but it wasn't a cloud, appeared over Costa Mesa. He saw it from Laguna Beach, but thousands of people saw this. Work stopped, traffic on the street stopped as people rushed out of their cars and stared. People ran out of their homes, pointing and looking and screaming at this huge, perfectly oval-shaped object, cloud-like object, that was hovering over Costa Mesa. And it clearly wasn't a cloud, because there were little lights, pastel-colored lights of many different colors, scintillating and darting around, not only inside it, but around the perimeter. And I will just let Walter describe in his own words his experience with this amazing sighting. As he says, "I saw something when I lived in Laguna Beach that thousands and thousands of people saw. Everyone was out in the streets looking at it. A big cloud that was perfectly oval-shaped. And colors moved around it. There were pinks and others, and they moved. They would scintillate and move around it. People were out in the streets. Everyone was looking at it. It was over Costa Mesa, but I saw it from Laguna Beach. The paper said that people were out in the streets in Costa Mesa. Thousands and thousands of people saw it, just staring at it, looking at it. And towards evening, the media dismissed it as some kind of thing. But I didn't think so. There were lights in it, and they were around it, moving through it, colored lights. And the thing was perfectly shaped, and it was moving slowly. People were just going, 'What is that?' Someone said, 'That's a cloud.' I said, 'Bull, that is not a cloud.'" So Walter watched this for at least a half an hour, and this thing was moving at a very slow pace over the city. And after about a half an hour, it moved off into the distance. The media dismissed it as atmospheric phenomena, something Walter vehemently does not agree with. This was, while it had a cloud-like appearance, the fact that there were so many of these multicolored lights moving all through it made him feel like this was a UFO of some kind, and he has no way to explain it other than that. It was a very dramatic sighting that was very widely viewed, and I think that was the whole point of it. When thousands upon thousands of people see something like this, it can cause a huge shift in public opinion on this subject. So now I'd like to move to the last case, which is another dramatic UFO display. And I call this one, "They Flew All Night." The main witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Robert. He's an office manager. I did work with him for a number of years. And this case took place in 1983 at Lake Nacimiento. This is in the Paso Robles area of California. And Robert and his friends were driving through the Lake Nacimiento area one evening when they saw something that they could not explain. Looking at it, they realized that this was not stars as they initially thought, but it was a ring of lights, dim sort of orbs, and in the center was a much larger bright light. So there was all these little objects surrounding one central object, and as they watched, these little lights would leave the main one and start darting around all over the place. So they stopped the car, got out, and looked at it, and that's when they noticed that there was several of these weird formations of lights. And they started putting on this dramatic display that lasted for hours. It really deeply impressed them. As Robert says, it was like, wow. It was a central light, and there were these other ones that would fly around it. It was really weird. I've never seen anything like it before. They just looked like a cluster of stars at first. There was one real bright one in the middle and a bunch of little ones around it, and the one in the middle was really bright. And you'd see them move. They'd dart across the sky, dart back, but they go back to the same place, which was kind of weird. They'd fly away from each other. Sometimes one or two would take off in a different direction, but the clusters didn't dart. There was a center object with like 5 or 6 around it, and the ones on the outside would dart across. So Robert and his friends were amazed, flabbergasted, and stared at these objects in amazement and disbelief, and tried to explain what they were seeing as helicopters or planes or anything. And finally, one of them very reluctantly brought up the word UFO, and all of them were surprised to see themselves agreeing. There was no other explanation for what they were seeing. These had to be some kind of UFOs, just judging not only by their appearance, but by the way they moved. Although they were quite high up there, there was absolutely no sound. And again, there was quite a few of these things, 4, maybe 5 main clusters, each with 5 or 6 lights around them. So this was quite a number of objects. And Robert and his friends decided to drive around to see if they could get a better viewpoint. And they saw a lot of other people pulled off the road looking at them. As Robert says, it was really weird. We went driving up to the lake, and there were other people standing around looking up. We just kind of looked at them, and they looked at us. It was weird. There were other people who pulled over looking up, watching. So we weren't the only idiots who saw it. So they watched this for hours upon hours, and at some point drove up high up onto the mountain to get a better look. And as Robert says, we were there after midnight, and they were still going on. We actually got bored of watching it. So they watched this for 2, 3, 4 hours, and as it got late, they decided to drive up to the top of a nearby mountain to see if they could get an even better look, and by the time they got up there, the objects were gone. But this was something that went on for many hours, most of the night, and really impressed them that these objects were wanting to be seen, were showing themselves off. And many, many people saw it. And that is a trademark of these UFO displays. And while in some of these cases that I cited, I'm only talking about 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 witnesses, I'm guessing that there were probably a lot more people who were also watching it, but do not report their sightings. And in this last case with Robert and these UFOs up at Lake Nacimiento, he scanned the newspapers the next day, watched the news. He was positive this was going to be front page news, television headlines. But of course it wasn't. There was no mention about it whatsoever. And I asked Robert if he reported his sighting to any media outlet, to the police, the Air Force, any UFO reporting center. He did not. That is one of the problems with these UFO sightings and the phenomena in general, is people do not report their sightings. 1 in 100 maybe will report their sightings. So any estimate of how many sightings there are is probably vastly underestimated. But I think these cases show a very unique and important type of UFO behavior, a UFO display. So those are the cases I wanted to present to you today. I did write about them in my book, 1 in 40, The UFO Epidemic. And while these are just simple sightings, again, they show this really important aspect of UFO behavior, where I think the ETs have an agenda to show themselves off, to announce their presence. It's in essence a publicity campaign to say, hey, you guys, you are not alone. We are up here. We are real. And that is, I think, absolutely the agenda behind this. And why would they do this? Why do they want to show themselves off? Why do they want us to know about them? I think at some point we're going to be looking at open official contact. And they are getting us used to their presence before they do a type of display that every single person on this planet will see, that will leave no doubt in anyone's minds that they are real, that will change the way we think about ourselves and our place in this universe forever. I think at some point we will have open official contact. Ever since the modern age of UFOs, UFO activity has been steadily escalating. So at some point, I think it's inevitable that we wake up to the fact that we are not alone. And when we do, when we can get over this stupid UFO cover-up, when disclosure happens, I think we will finally be ready for that type of display where everyone in the world knows that UFOs are real, and this will no longer be labeled a mystery. And I, for one, look forward to that day. So that's the episode today. I think it's really important that people recognize UFOs are real and that they're trying to get us used to their presence. And that's why I wanted to present these cases for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I want to thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it. So until next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking questions. And most important, keep having fun.